French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars between 1792 and 1815 would pose a challenge unlike any other Britain had faced. The British Army would have to expand to a scale unseen in its history, climbing from 50,000 men in 1792 to a peak strength of 650,000, including militia and volunteers, in 1805, supported by new systems and industries at home. And more than that, if it were to be successful, it would have to adapt to face the new threats presented by Napoleonic forces and tactics. The American Revolution had shown that mobilizing and militarizing ordinary people could reap great strategic rewards during the age of revolutions. It had also exposed some of the pitfalls of creaky systems of recruitment, support, and elitism in British systems. To counter these threats, the government of the day sought to mobilize manpower in a way it had not done so before. The first of these was a big drive to add to the size of the military available for campaigning. We're exploring this subject at Dover Castle, home to one of many regimental museums whose collections chart the military history of the United Kingdom. Dover was extensively remodelled during the Napoleonic Wars, becoming a barracks and garrison town as the British responded to fears of French invasion. So can we get a snapshot of the British Army in the early 1790s at the start of the wars?
Okay, we're looking then at a comparatively small army by European standards, about 50,000 strong. And within that, you've got a very widely dispersed army, so parts of it are tied up in the British Empire, particularly in India and in the West Indies in garrison duty. And then within the British Isles themselves, units are quite widely dispersed. So somewhere like where we are today at Dover Castle, you would have had a complete regiment here, and it could then have trained sort of quite well as a complete unit, but elsewhere a lot of units are divided up. Partly that's because they're billeted in private houses or public houses, and also you have a problem where there's no police force at that time, so actually the soldiers are doing a lot of police duty and are widely dispersed to do that, particularly in the south of England, Sussex, Kent. They're involved against smugglers. In some ways you're still looking at a defeated army. This is the army that had been defeated in America in 1783, but there had been some reforms that had gone ahead in the late 1780s and early 1790s. Soldiers' pay had been improved a little, a standard drill manual had been brought in, so all regiments are meant to be trained in the same way, and there were a few other things that were done in terms of recruitment, for example, that can be seen as progressive and an important change to what had gone on in the 1770s and 1780s.
So how successful were these reforms?
Well, the events of 1793-95, particularly in the Low Countries, suggest that they weren't really that successful. The problem really was that the army was too small, only 50,000, and then a lot of the regiments that are sent abroad in the 1790s are actually raised more or less from scratch, so there's very little sort of professionalism within the new units that are raised. Most officers at this point are still buying their commissions. That's how they become officers. They don't have to go through a cadet college. They don't have to do any specialist training. So there is a real problem on that front. And then the sort of decision to send units out to the West Indies and so on means that the casualty rates are incredibly high in some of these units, so men don't get a chance to really become trained soldiers before they succumb to disease.
So how ought we to think about these regular soldiers then?
So the Duke of Wellington famously said of his men that they formed the scum of the earth. But what people don't realise is that he followed that up by saying he was full of admiration for their courage and their discipline when under fire. What he was referring to with that phrase was actually their social origins, with many of the men joining the British Army voluntarily, but as a result of what's called the compulsion of destitution. So basically these guys were quite often down and out in terms of their financial and job prospects, leading them to a life in the army. You could have those who were, completely down and out vagabonds, roaming the streets that were sort of impressed into the army, but others maybe just as a downturn of the economy in the short term, looking for the king's shilling to tide them over. Others would join out of a desire for adventure, but might find life under arms a bit more brutal than they had originally anticipated.
So were these the kind of professional soldiers that would have fought in the British armies in the Caribbean, the Peninsular Wars or Waterloo?
Yeah, absolutely. The British Army at this time has representatives from across the British Isles, so naturally you'd have English, Scots, Welsh, but a huge proportion of Irish soldiers as well. About 40% of the British Army at this time are Irish, largely a result of the economic situation in Ireland at the time. So this would form the bulk of the British Army fighting across the world. But we need to remember that the British Army also raised other types of regiments as well. So in the Caribbean, for instance, from 1795 all the way through to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they raised 8 regiments in the West Indies. So these are regiments officered by white officers, but filled with former slaves that have escaped from the United States, or slaves purchased or impressed as soon as they get off the ships from Africa. After 1807 and the abolition of the slave trade, these soldiers obtain some sort of parity with their white counterparts. They're treated differently, they're freed, and they obtain a status within the British Army which is superior to many of the colonial units that the British Army utilises at this time as well.
So how international was the British Army then?
So the British Army is a very multinational force. Under the command of the Duke of Wellington, at various stages you have armies and contingents from across Europe, notably the King's German Legion, for instance, which is initially from Hanover, but by the end of the war is taking in Germans from across the German lands that are now occupied by Napoleon. We can sort of think of it as an army in exile, so they retain their a certain degree of independence within the British Army, but they're very firmly under the Duke's command. At other times, the British Army is heavily involved with the Spanish and Portuguese during the Peninsular Wars. They're integrated into the British forces quite a lot as well. And then by the time you get to Waterloo, you've got plenty of Dutch and Belgian formations that equally find themselves under British command. And on top of all this, the British are often fighting in coalition with their allies. So you've got European allies, and you've got indigenous allies from across the empire as well. So it's a very multinational, international force.
Documents at the National Archives showcase the broad range of people involved in British military campaigns in the Age of Revolutions. We asked their research team to give us a sense of where this is found in historical sources.
Hello, my name is Will Butler and I'm the Head of Military Records at the National Archives. And the document that I'd like to talk about here is an extract from the description and succession book of the 28th Regiment of Foot, dated 1795 to 1806. The regiment, known as the 28th North Gloucestershire Regiment of Foot, fought during the Peninsular War, most notably during the Battle of Talavera in 1809, and was one of the few Peninsular War veteran regiments to serve during the 100 Days campaign in 1815, and was also present at the Battle of Waterloo. And we can really get a sense of the social makeup of the regiment by looking at these records, and these records exist for the majority of regiments who served during this time, as well as to find detailed information about individuals who were present at some of the key events during this period. They provide us with an array of information about the individuals recorded in the books. As well as their names, we see information such as their height upon enlistment, their age, what colour their eyes and hair were, and where they were born. At a time when a large proportion of those serving in the British Army came from Ireland, you can see in this extract a number who state their place of birth in Irish counties. Importantly, the book also includes the trade of an individual, i.e. what job they did before joining up. And this gives us as historians a really important insight as to the social makeup of the ranks of the army. These records in the WO25 series, held at the National Archives of the United Kingdom, are digitised and downloadable, so I encourage anyone interested in delving more into the social composition of the British Army at this time to take a look and see what they can tell the historian about the army during this period.
Because it relied on volunteers signing up as soldiers, the British regular army could never recruit the numbers the government wanted or generals needed, prompting significant and creative efforts to mobilise manpower. It did not help, of course, that the death rate from disease for British units sent to fight in Caribbean theatres was so appalling throughout the 1790s. Other problems occurred when militia, raised for home defence only, were conscripted at home, rather than the tens of thousands of militiamen that were hoped for. Raising forces in Ireland in 1793 and Scotland in 1797 met with severe rioting, some of it feeding off both regions' long-standing grievances about British rule and recent examples of active liberation movements. Still, extensive volunteer units were formed throughout the country and reached a peak of 400,000 during the very real French invasion threat of 1803 to 05. Volunteers were only part-time soldiers, and many refused to serve away from their hometowns. They would prove no use in the regular army's overseas campaigning in the Peninsular War of 1807 to 1814 that sought to prevent Napoleon from completely overrunning Portugal and Spain. So how are these volunteers and militia viewed by their society, and what would have been their incentives to participate?
Well, it rather depends who we're thinking of in terms of society and where as part of it as well. There is a regional aspect to this. So in the south of England, the volunteers might be seen as a thoroughly good thing. If you lived in this area, you would see them as a useful line of defence, and they'd probably reassure local people that there would be some military force to help to protect them in the event of a French invasion. A lot of regular military officers in the south of England weren't terribly convinced by them and thought that a lot of it was simply men playing at soldiers, that these units would not really be of any use if there was a French invasion. If you're looking elsewhere in the country, some of these units get a fairly poor reputation in carrying out policing tactics that are seen of a very, very repressive type. So in Ireland in 1787, 1788, they're involved in house-to-house searches for arms, which often sees people tortured and property destroyed. They do deploy as more recognisably proper, normal military units in the 1788 rebellion in Ireland, so some of them do actually see action there. In terms of incentives, you get the impression that some men didn't really get much choice about whether they were in these units or not. If you were a clerk who worked for the Bank of England, or you were a clerk that worked for the Honourable East India Company, you were essentially going to be in their volunteer unit, and perhaps that did something to help your job prospects and promotion. Elsewhere, there are sort of ideas that men enjoy the sort of dressing up, and something about masculinity and being able to look like soldiers was supposedly a big draw of the volunteer force, which is very popular at its height, 350,000 members. In terms of pay, not really much for the volunteers, though militiamen were paid the same sort of sums of money as regular soldiers, and they were also paid a recruitment enlistment bounty, which was deemed to be a considerable amount of money for the time, something like 6 months' pay. So there were good financial incentives there, but most of the volunteers were serving without any pay, so there's not really a strict financial incentive for them.
To achieve the uptake in volunteering and ensure the smooth recruitment of new regiments, the British Army needed to seriously re-evaluate how it recruited men, and how it could bring members of all social classes into the fold. One of the key figures in these reforms was Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, who sought to use volunteering, especially in the case of Ireland, as a way to foment loyalty to the Crown and to Britain. Another key figure in the raising of these new regiments, in Scotland in particular, where he was nicknamed King Henry IX, was Henry Dundas. Across the British Isles, the day-to-day responsibility for raising the militia and volunteers was delegated to the Lord Lieutenants. These officers were responsible for sourcing men, either through a ballot or those willing to join voluntarily, to fill these new regiments. But local pressure, including the efforts of wives, mothers, religious congregations and peer groups, had important parts to play. Still, it was a measure of the impact of warfare that a higher proportion of men in the UK served in arms in 1793 to 1815 than would in the First World War between 1914 to 1918. The rapid expansion and adaptation of the army required by the Napoleonic Wars had changed the complexion of the British military in key ways. The army had grown to 250,000 men by 1815, developing into a major European army and a more professional force, notably in the development of light infantry. After the Napoleonic Wars, the size of the army was cut to save money, and it reverted to an imperial defence role, defending an expanding empire. Indeed, when the British Army again sent a major force overseas in 1854 during the Crimean War, it was thought that too many of the lessons of the Age of Revolutions had been forgotten.